I lie bleeding on my brother's doorstep at 2 in the morning, my shoulder grotesquely twisted face swollen beyond recognition. I pound weakly on the door with my good arm gasping through broken ribs. My stepfather Gary's final words echo, "Sign those loan papers or you're dead to this family." My mother stood watching, arms crossed, as Gary's fists connected again and again. Now my vision blurs as I collapse against the cold concrete, wondering if anyone will find me before I lose consciousness completely on this freezing December night in suburban Cleveland. My name is Susanna, and I never thought my life would come to this. 6 months ago, I was just a 28-year-old dental hygienist, living peacefully in my modest Cleveland apartment, proud of the independence I had built after graduating from community college. I worked hard, paid my bills on time, and maintained excellent credit. Life felt stable for the first time since my father died in that construction accident 5 years earlier. Everything changed when my mother Linda remarried Gary 3 years ago. At first, he seemed like the answer to her prayers. Charming, attentive, always bringing flowers, and taking her to nice restaurants. He swept her off her feet during her most vulnerable period, promising to take care of her and help heal our broken family. Gary appeared successful with his talk of business ventures and investment opportunities. He wore expensive suits, drove a shiny black pickup truck, and spoke confidently about his plans to build a food service empire. But beneath that polished exterior lurked something darker that I began noticing during family dinners. Gary's stories never quite added up. His business ventures kept changing details every time he mentioned them. One week it was a gourmet food truck specializing in fusion cuisine. The next, it was a catering company for corporate events. Then suddenly it became a restaurant supply business. The numbers he quoted seemed inflated, the timelines impossible, and his explanations grew more elaborate with each telling. My younger brother Jake, 25 and working as a mechanic at Thompson's Auto Repair, noticed it too. During quiet moments when Gary stepped outside for his frequent phone calls, Jake would catch my eye and shake his head. We both sensed something was wrong, but Mom seemed so happy after years of loneliness that neither of us wanted to burst her bubble. The first real warning sign came during Thanksgiving dinner last year. Gary had been drinking more than usual, his carefully maintained facade slipping as he ranted about ungrateful family members who didn't appreciate his vision. He kept emphasizing how successful people help each other, how family loyalty meant financial loyalty, and how he expected everyone at the table to support his business dreams. His eyes kept drifting to me as he spoke, and I felt an uncomfortable chill despite the warm house. After that dinner, Gary began showing up at my apartment unannounced, always with some excuse about being in the neighborhood. He would comment on my furniture, asking pointed questions about my rent, my salary, my savings account. He praised my responsibility and good credit, mentioning how rare it was to find young people with such financial stability. At first I thought he was being friendly, maybe even proud of my achievements. But his questions became more invasive, more focused on specific numbers and account details. The loan requests started small. Gary mentioned needing a co-signer for equipment financing, just a temporary arrangement, until his credit improved after some past misunderstandings with creditors. He painted vivid pictures of the food truck empire we could build together, promising I would be a silent partner with guaranteed returns on my investment. When I politely declined, explaining that I wasn't comfortable mixing family relationships with business obligations, his demeanor shifted noticeably. The warm smile became forced, his voice carried an edge, and he made subtle comments about family members who supported each other versus those who were selfish. My mother began calling regularly, always steering conversations toward Gary's business plans and how much they meant to him. She would mention how stressed he was becoming, how his past failures were affecting his confidence, and how much it would mean if someone in the family showed faith in his abilities. The pressure was gentle but constant, designed to make me feel guilty for not embracing Gary's vision. But I had learned to research financial decisions carefully after watching my father struggle with debt before his death. I spent hours online investigating food truck businesses, startup costs, permit requirements, and success rates. The numbers Gary quoted were wildly unrealistic. Equipment that he claimed cost $50,000 was available for $15,000. Permits he said required extensive legal fees could be obtained through simple city applications. Most disturbing, I discovered that food truck businesses in our area had extremely high failure rates, with most closing within 2 years due to oversaturation and high operating costs. During one Sunday dinner in early November, I made the mistake of sharing my research with Gary. I brought printed articles about food truck challenges, hoping to engage in a productive conversation about realistic business planning. Instead, Gary's face darkened with rage. He accused me of trying to sabotage his dreams, of being jealous of his success, of disrespecting his experience and knowledge. His voice rose to a shout as he claimed I was too young and stupid to understand real business opportunities. What shocked me most was my mother's reaction. Instead of defending me or asking Gary to calm down, she sat silently, her face pale with fear. When I tried to explain that I was only trying to help by providing accurate information, she quickly changed the subject and began clearing dishes with shaking hands. That night, I realized my mother was already afraid of Gary, though she would never admit it. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, when I discovered through my dental office's credit monitoring service that someone had been making unauthorized inquiries on my credit report. Multiple loan companies and banks had pulled my information without my permission, each inquiry potentially damaging my excellent credit score. When I called to investigate, I learned that someone claiming to be my business partner had been shopping for commercial loans using my personal information as collateral. The loan officer at First National Bank was particularly helpful. She explained that a man matching Gary's description had visited twice, claiming that I was his business partner, and had verbally agreed to co-sign for a $50,000 commercial loan. He had brought preliminary paperwork with my signature practiced multiple times, though it was obviously forged. The banker had been suspicious because the signatures were inconsistent, and because I had never appeared in person to verify the information. When I confronted Gary about the unauthorized credit checks during a tense phone conversation, he denied everything at first, then claimed it was all a misunderstanding. He said he had only mentioned my name as a potential investor, that the banks had misunderstood his intentions. But his explanations were clearly rehearsed, and his anger at being caught was barely concealed beneath his false apologies. That evening, I drove to the bank Gary had mentioned and spoke directly with the loan officer who had handled his applications. She showed me copies of the forged documents, pointing out the multiple attempts to replicate my signature and the detailed financial information about my employment and income that only someone close to me would know. The officer explained that Gary had been quite persuasive, presenting himself as a successful businessman who was bringing his stepdaughter into the family business as a responsible co-signer. Seeing those forged documents was like being punched in the stomach. Gary had been planning this financial fraud for months, carefully gathering information about my personal finances and practicing my signature until he could replicate it convincingly. He had researched my workplace, my income, my credit history, and my banking relationships. This wasn't a desperate last-minute scheme, but a calculated, premeditated attempt to steal my identity and destroy my financial future. I realized that Gary had been systematically preparing to make me liable for his debts while he disappeared with the loan money, leaving me to face collections agents and potential criminal charges for fraud. The thought of how close he had come to succeeding terrified me and made me understand just how dangerous he really was. The next morning, I called my mother to tell her about the forged documents, hoping she would finally see Gary for who he really was. Instead of shock or anger, I heard fear in her voice. She begged me not to make trouble, claiming that Gary was under tremendous stress and that I must have misunderstood the situation. When I insisted that I had seen actual forged signatures with my own eyes, she became defensive, saying that Gary would never do such a thing and that the bank must have made an error. But her voice shook as she spoke, and I could hear Gary's voice in the background demanding to know who she was talking to. When she suddenly hung up without saying goodbye, I knew she was in deeper trouble than I had imagined. Gary wasn't just manipulating me, he was controlling my mother through fear and intimidation. I decided to visit other banks and loan companies to see how far Gary's deception extended. At Cleveland Commercial Lending, I discovered he had presented himself as my business partner and had already submitted preliminary loan applications for $75,000. At Community Trust Bank, he had inquired about a business line of credit for $100,000, again using my information without permission. Each institution had copies of documents bearing my forged signature, and each loan officer remembered Gary as charming but oddly evasive about specific business details. The scope of his fraud was staggering. Gary had been systematically visiting every major lender in the Cleveland area, shopping for the largest possible loans while presenting me as his willing business partner and co-signer. He had created detailed business plans for various food service ventures, complete with fake financial projections and market research. Some documents even included photographs of food trucks he claimed to own, though reverse image searches revealed they were stock photos stolen from equipment dealers' websites. Most disturbing was the level of personal information Gary had compiled about me. The loan applications included details about my employment history, my exact salary, my apartment address, my car payments, even my student loan balance. He knew about my savings account at 3 different banks, my retirement contributions, and my monthly expenses down to the dollar. This level of financial surveillance meant he had either hacked my personal accounts or convinced my mother to provide information from private family conversations. When I arrived home from my banking investigation, I found Gary waiting in my apartment building's parking lot. He was leaning against his black pickup truck, arms crossed, watching my building with the patience of a predator. When he saw me, he smiled and waved as if our last conversation had been pleasant. He approached carrying a bouquet of expensive roses and wearing his most charming expression. "Susanna, sweetheart, I think we had a little misunderstanding yesterday," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "I brought these to apologize for any confusion about the bank situation. Can we go inside and talk? I think you'll be very interested in what I have to show you." Against my better judgment, I agreed to let him into my apartment, curious about what new lies he would tell. Gary made himself comfortable on my couch, spreading official-looking documents across my coffee table. He had brought a leather portfolio filled with contracts, business plans, and financial projections that looked professionally prepared. "I know you're concerned about the loan situation, and you have every right to be," Gary said, his tone reasonable and apologetic. "But I think you'll see that this is actually a tremendous opportunity for both of us. These documents will show you exactly how we can build something amazing together." The papers were impressive at first glance. Gary had created a comprehensive business plan for Cleveland Mobile Cuisine, complete with market analysis, competitor research, financial forecasts, and operational procedures. The documents projected monthly revenues of $25,000 and annual profits exceeding $200,000. Charts and graphs showed steady growth over a 5-year period with projections for expanding to multiple trucks and eventually opening a brick-and-mortar restaurant. But as I read more carefully, the flaws became obvious. The market research was based on outdated information from other cities with completely different demographics. The financial projections assumed unrealistic sales volumes with no consideration for seasonal variations, weather impacts, or competition. The operational costs were severely underestimated, with no allowance for equipment repairs, permit renewals, or employee benefits. Most tellingly, the business plan included no contingency funds for the inevitable challenges that destroy most food service startups. "Gary, these numbers don't make sense," I said, pointing to a chart that showed consistent daily sales regardless of weather or location. "Food trucks can't generate this level of revenue during Cleveland winters, and you haven't accounted for health department regulations, parking restrictions, or fuel costs." His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Susanna, you're thinking too small. This isn't just about one food truck. This is about building a brand, creating a mobile restaurant empire. The numbers represent our potential, not just our starting point." As he spoke, Gary pulled out additional documents that made my blood run cold. These were detailed loan applications from 6 different banks, each bearing my forged signature and personal financial information. The applications requested amounts ranging from $50,000 to $150,000, with various explanations for the intended use of funds. Some claimed I was an equal business partner, others described me as a family investor, and a few presented me as the primary borrower with Gary as my business consultant. "I've already done most of the legwork," Gary continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "These banks are ready to approve our loans as soon as you confirm your participation. All you need to do is sign these verification forms, and we can have the money within a week." The verification forms were designed to make the fraud official. By signing them, I would be confirming that I had indeed applied for these loans, that I understood the repayment terms, and that I accepted full legal responsibility for the debts. Gary was asking me to voluntarily legitimize his identity theft and make myself liable for potentially $500,000 in business loans. "Gary, I'm not signing anything," I said firmly. "You forged my signature on these applications without my permission. That's identity theft and fraud. I could report you to the police right now." His expression changed completely. The charming mask disappeared, replaced by cold anger. "You ungrateful little girl," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what I've done for your family? I married your mother when nobody else wanted her. I've been supporting her emotionally and financially for 3 years. And this is how you repay me." Gary stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over my coffee table. At 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing at least 220 pounds, he was physically intimidating when angry. His hands clenched into fists as he paced around my small living room. "Your mother needs this business to succeed," he continued, his voice rising. "She's invested her entire retirement fund in supporting my vision. If these loans don't go through, she'll lose everything. Her house, her savings, her future. And it will be your fault for being selfish and stupid." This revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother had already given Gary access to her retirement money, the nest egg my father had worked so hard to build before his death. Gary had been systematically draining her resources while planning to use my credit for even larger amounts. He wasn't just trying to defraud me, he was destroying my mother's financial security in the process. "What have you done with her retirement money?" I demanded. Gary's laugh was cruel and satisfied. I've been investing it in business development, market research, and equipment deposits. Every dollar has gone toward building our future success. But it's not enough. We need working capital, startup funds, and operational reserves. That's where you come in, sweetheart. The way he said sweetheart made my skin crawl. There was nothing affectionate about it. It was pure mockery and contempt. Gary was enjoying my distress, feeding off my horror at discovering how completely he had manipulated our family's finances. As he continued talking, I realized he was recording our conversation on his phone. The device was partially hidden beneath some of the loan documents, but I could see the red recording light blinking. Gary was creating evidence to use against me later, probably planning to edit the recording to make it sound like I had agreed to participate in his schemes. "I think you should leave now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need time to think about everything you've told me." "Oh, you'll have plenty of time to think," Gary replied, gathering his documents but leaving the forged loan applications on my table. "But not too much time. These banks have approval deadlines, and some very dangerous people are expecting their money soon. I'd hate for anyone to get hurt because of your stubbornness." The threat was clear. Gary was implying that he owed money to people who might resort to violence if they weren't repaid. Whether this was true or just another manipulation tactic, it added a new layer of fear to an already terrifying situation. After Gary left, I immediately called Jake to warn him about what was happening. My brother listened in shocked silence as I described the forged documents, the depleted retirement fund, and Gary's escalating threats. Jake confirmed my suspicions that Gary had been asking questions about my work schedule, my daily routines, and my personal relationships. "Susanna, this guy is dangerous," Jake said. "You need to call the police and report the identity theft, and maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while. I don't trust him not to do something crazy." But I made a decision that would nearly cost me my life. Instead of involving law enforcement immediately, I decided to gather more evidence and try to protect my mother from the consequences of Gary's crimes. I thought I could outsmart him, document his fraud, and find a way to save my family without destroying my mother's life in the process. That decision almost killed me. The next few days brought a constant stream of harassment that made me realize Gary's desperation was reaching dangerous levels. He began showing up everywhere I went, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid obvious stalking charges, but close enough to make his presence felt. When I stopped for coffee before work, Gary would be sitting in his truck across the street. When I went grocery shopping, he would appear in the same aisle pretending to shop while watching my every move. My coworkers at Cleveland Dental Associates noticed immediately. Dr. Patricia Wells, my supervising dentist, pulled me aside after the third day of Gary's parking lot surveillance. "Susanna, there's a man who's been sitting in the parking lot during your shifts," she said, concern evident in her voice. "He seems to be watching our building. Should I call security?" I explained the situation briefly, not wanting to involve my workplace in family drama, but needing support from people I trusted. Dr. Wells insisted that I park in the secured staff area behind the building and suggested I vary my schedule to make it harder for Gary to predict my movements. But Gary's surveillance extended beyond simple stalking. He had begun befriending my neighbors, presenting himself as a concerned stepfather, worried about my well-being. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who lived below me, mentioned that a nice man had stopped by asking about my health and whether I had been acting strangely lately. Mr. Rodriguez, who managed the apartment building, told me that someone matching Gary's description had inquired about my lease terms and whether I had been having financial difficulties. Gary was systematically building a narrative that I was mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. He was laying groundwork to discredit me if I tried to report his crimes or resist his manipulation. The sophistication of his psychological warfare made me understand that he had probably done this before, that my family wasn't his first target. The most disturbing development came when I discovered Gary had been researching my dating life and personal relationships. My friend Rachel called me in tears, explaining that an attractive older man had approached her at the coffee shop where she worked, claiming to be my stepfather. Gary had been charming and concerned, expressing worry that I was making poor decisions and associating with bad influences. "He seemed so nice and genuinely worried about you," Rachel said. "He asked about your boyfriends, your social life, whether you had been drinking or using drugs. I told him you were the most responsible person I know, but now I'm wondering if I said too much." Gary was mapping my entire social network, identifying potential allies and vulnerabilities he could exploit. He was also gathering personal information that only a close friend would know, details he could use to manipulate me more effectively or damage my reputation if needed. The pressure campaign intensified when Linda called me crying, begging me to reconsider helping Gary with his business venture. Her voice was shaky and desperate, and I could hear Gary coaching her in the background, telling her what to say. "Susanna, honey, Gary is in real trouble," my mother sobbed. "The people who were going to invest in his food truck business are threatening to sue him if he doesn't get the startup loan approved. He could lose everything, and so could I. Our house is collateral for some of the agreements he signed." This was the first I had heard about my mother's house being used as collateral for Gary's business schemes. The family home where I had grown up, where my father had built a workshop in the basement and my mother had tended her garden for 20 years, was now at risk because of Gary's manipulations. "Mom, what exactly did Gary make you sign?" I asked. "Just some partnership agreements," she said evasively. "Nothing major. But if the business doesn't get funding, we could lose the house. Gary says you're the only one who can save us now." I realized that Gary had been using my mother as collateral for months, probably promising investors that his wealthy stepdaughter would guarantee any debts. He had put her home at risk to secure agreements he never intended to honor, and now he was using her desperation to pressure me into legitimizing his fraud. That evening, Gary arrived at my apartment with a lawyer friend who claimed to specialize in family business law. The lawyer, a thin man named Douglas Pierce, who wore an expensive suit but had nervous eyes, carried a briefcase full of legal documents designed to intimidate me with complex jargon and official-looking seals. "Miss Susanna," Pierce said in a practiced voice, "I understand you have concerns about participating in your stepfather's business venture. However, I must inform you that your family has already created certain legal obligations that could make you liable for existing commitments." Pierce spread contracts across my kitchen table, pointing to clauses and signatures that supposedly bound me to Gary's business partnerships. The documents were sophisticated forgeries, complete with notary seals and witness signatures designed to make it appear that I had already agreed to participate in Gary's ventures. "These partnership agreements were signed by your mother as your legal representative based on verbal commitments you allegedly made during family discussions," Pierce continued. "If you refuse to honor these agreements, you could be sued for breach of contract and interference with business relationships. It was an elaborate bluff designed to convince me that I was already legally trapped and that cooperation was my only option. The documents were fake, but they were convincing enough to frighten someone without legal knowledge into believing they were authentic." Gary watched my reaction carefully, gauging whether his latest manipulation tactic was working. When he saw doubt and fear in my eyes, he pressed his advantage. "Susanna, I didn't want it to come to this," Gary said, his voice falsely sympathetic. "But you forced my hand by being unreasonable. These legal commitments exist whether you acknowledge them or not. The question is whether you want to honor them voluntarily or be compelled through court action." The lawyer nodded gravely, adding weight to Gary's threats. "I've seen similar cases result in significant financial judgments against family members who refuse to honor their obligations. The courts don't look favorably on people who make commitments and then try to back out when it becomes inconvenient. I knew the documents were fake, but the legal jargon was intimidating, and the possibility that Gary had somehow created real legal obligations through forgery and manipulation was terrifying. I asked for time to have the contracts reviewed by my own attorney, but Pierce claimed that the approval deadlines made delay impossible. "The banks require immediate confirmation of your participation," Pierce said. "Any delay could result in the automatic enforcement of existing penalty clauses that would make you liable for substantial damages." As they prepared to leave, Gary pulled out his phone and played a recording that shattered my remaining composure. It was my mother's voice, clearly distressed, making statements that made me sound selfish and ungrateful. "Susanna has always been stubborn and self-centered," Linda's voice said through the phone speaker. "She doesn't care about family loyalty or helping others succeed. I'm embarrassed by her selfishness, especially after everything Gary has done for us. Gary works so hard to build something for our family's future," my mother continued in the recording. "But Susanna is too selfish to appreciate his vision. She would rather see us fail than risk anything to help us succeed." The recording went on for several minutes with my mother saying increasingly hurtful things about my character, my priorities, and my relationship with the family. Some of her words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "She's never really been grateful for the sacrifices we made for her education and her opportunities," Linda's voice concluded. "Maybe it's time she learned what it means to support a family instead of always taking from it." Gary smiled as he watched my face crumble. "Your mother recorded this message yesterday after our conversation about your refusal to help the family business. She wanted me to know how she really feels about your selfishness." I was devastated. Hearing my mother's cruel assessment of my character, knowing that she saw me as selfish and ungrateful, despite everything I had tried to do for our family since Dad's death, broke something inside me. Gary had successfully turned my own mother against me, using her fear and desperation to extract statements that would haunt me for years. "She's been very upset about your attitude." Gary continued savoring my emotional destruction. "Linda feels like she failed as a mother because you turned out so self-centered. She's considering cutting off contact with you entirely if you don't start showing more family loyalty." The threat was clear. If I didn't sign Gary's loan documents and legitimize his fraud, he would destroy my relationship with my mother permanently. He had recordings of her criticizing me, and he could easily manipulate her into believing that I had betrayed the family when they needed me most. But as I sat there listening to my mother's hurtful words, something else became clear. Gary had orchestrated this entire recording session coaching my mother to say things she probably didn't mean, exploiting her fear and desperation to create weapons against me. The woman on that recording wasn't really my mother. It was a terrified victim being manipulated by a master manipulator. That realization gave me the strength to resist Gary's latest psychological attack, though it would take much more courage than I possessed at that moment to realize what I would need to do to save my family from his predatory schemes. After Gary and his fake lawyer left my apartment, I spent the night crying and trying to process the betrayal I felt from hearing my mother's recorded words. Every cruel statement echoed in my mind, making me question whether Gary was right about my selfishness and whether I really was destroying my family by refusing to help his business venture. But by morning, anger had replaced despair. I called Dr. Wells and took a personal day, then drove straight to a real attorney's office to have Gary's documents analyzed. Jennifer Martinez, an attorney who specialized in financial fraud cases, spent 2 hours reviewing the contracts and loan applications that Gary had left with me. These documents are sophisticated forgeries, Martinez concluded, but they have no legal validity whatsoever. The partnership agreements purport to be notarized, but the notary seals are fake. The witness signatures don't match any real persons, and the legal language is copied from legitimate contracts, but used incorrectly. Martinez explained that Gary's fake lawyer was probably an accomplice rather than a licensed attorney, and that the threats about existing legal obligations were completely fabricated. She also pointed out that the recorded conversation with my mother was likely obtained through coercion and could never be used as evidence in any legitimate legal proceeding. Your stepfather is running a sophisticated fraud operation, Martinez said. He's using psychological manipulation and fake legal documents to convince you that you're trapped when you actually have no legal obligations whatsoever. I strongly recommend that you report this to law enforcement immediately. Armed with professional confirmation that Gary's threats were empty, I felt confident enough to confront him directly. I called and demanded a meeting, telling him I wanted to discuss his business proposal one final time. Gary agreed eagerly, probably thinking his psychological warfare was finally breaking down my resistance. We met at a restaurant near my mother's house neutral ground, where Gary would need to maintain his public facade of respectability. I brought a small digital recorder in my purse, hoping to capture Gary's admissions of fraud that I could use as evidence later. Gary arrived wearing his most expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that he claimed contained revised loan documents with more favorable terms. He was charming and apologetic, acting as if our previous confrontations had been minor misunderstandings that could be resolved through reasonable compromise. Susanna, I've been thinking about our conversation and I realize I may have been too pushy. Gary said, his voice smooth and reasonable. I understand your concerns about the business venture, and I want to address them properly. He opened his briefcase and removed new contracts that appeared more professional and legitimate than his previous forgeries. These documents included detailed business plans, financial projections, and partnership agreements that looked like they had been prepared by real attorneys. I've restructured the partnership to give you more control and better profit-sharing arrangements, Gary continued. You would be a 50% partner with full access to all financial records and decision-making authority. This isn't just about lending money, it's about building wealth together as a family. The revised contracts were still fraudulent, but they were much more sophisticated than Gary's previous attempts. He had invested significant time and money in creating documents that could fool casual inspection, complete with fake law firm letterheads and forged attorney signatures. Gary, I've had your previous contracts reviewed by a real attorney, I said, watching his reaction carefully. She confirmed that they're forgeries with no legal validity. The notary seals are fake. The witness signatures don't exist, and your lawyer friend isn't licensed to practice law in Ohio. Gary's composure cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly. I think your attorney may have been mistaken, he said, though his voice carried a new edge. Perhaps she didn't have all the relevant information about our business structure. She also told me that you've been committing identity theft by forging my signature on loan applications, I continued. That's a federal crime that carries serious prison time. Now Gary's mask began to slip more obviously. His jaw tightened and his hands clenched on the table as he realized that his sophisticated manipulation campaign was failing. Susanna, you're making a serious mistake, he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. I owe money to people who don't accept excuses or delays. If these business loans don't go through, there will be consequences for everyone in this family. This was the first time Gary had openly admitted to owing money to dangerous creditors, though I suspected this might be another manipulation tactic designed to frighten me into compliance. Whether real or fictional, the threat carried weight because Gary's desperation was obviously genuine. "Who do you owe money to?" I asked. Gary's laugh was bitter and scary. "Let's just say they're not the kind of people who accept partial payments or payment plans. They expect full repayment on schedule with interest, or they start collecting through other methods." He leaned forward across the table, his imposing frame casting a shadow over our conversation. "These aren't bank executives who'll send polite collection letters. They know where your mother lives, where your brother works, where you go to work every day. Family loyalty works both ways, sweetheart. If you won't help protect this family, maybe you don't deserve to be part of it." The threat was unmistakable. Gary was implying that his creditors would target me, my mother, and Jake if his debts weren't repaid. Whether these creditors existed or were part of Gary's manipulation strategy, the threat felt real and immediate. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, making sure my hidden recorder captured his response clearly. "I'm explaining reality," Gary replied. "Your selfish refusal to help your family has consequences beyond your sheltered little world. Sometimes grown-up problems require grown-up solutions, whether spoiled children understand them or not." Gary stood up abruptly, towering over the table as other restaurant patrons began to notice our tense conversation. His voice remained low, but carried unmistakable menace. "You have 48 hours to reconsider your position," he said. "After that, I won't be able to protect you from the consequences of your selfishness. Your mother's house, your brother's safety, your own well-being. Everything depends on whether you're mature enough to put family first." He left money on the table for his untouched coffee and walked away without looking back, leaving me shaking with fear and anger. The recording I had captured was damning evidence of Gary's threats and implied fraud, but I knew that involving law enforcement would probably destroy my mother's life along with Gary's. That evening, I called Jake to warn him about Gary's escalating threats and to make sure he understood the danger our family was facing. My brother listened grimly as I described the forged documents, the identity theft, and Gary's claims about dangerous creditors. "Susanna, this has gone way beyond family drama," Jake said. "This guy is a career criminal who's been planning to rob us blind and disappear. Mom is never going to see that money again, and we'll all be lucky if we don't end up liable for his debts." Jake had reached the same conclusion I was approaching reluctantly. Gary wasn't just a selfish stepfather trying to manipulate family members for financial gain. He was a predator who had systematically targeted our family using my mother's loneliness and vulnerability to gain access to our resources and credit. His charming facade had hidden a calculated criminal operation designed to steal everything we owned and leave us to face the consequences alone. "We need to get Mom away from him before this gets worse," Jake continued. "But first we need to document everything he's done so we can protect ourselves when this whole scheme collapses." I agreed to meet Jake the next day to plan our strategy, but I made another crucial mistake by underestimating Gary's desperation and capacity for violence. I thought I could continue gathering evidence while keeping myself safe through careful precautions. I didn't realize that Gary had already decided to use physical force to get what he wanted, regardless of the consequences for our family relationships. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Rachel, my best friend since high school, was crying as she confessed something that made my blood run cold. "Susanna, I need to tell you something terrible," she sobbed. "That man who said he was your stepfather, Gary, he's been calling me for weeks, asking me out, taking me to dinner. I thought he was just being friendly because of the family connection, but last night he wanted me to..." Rachel couldn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Gary had been systematically seducing my best friend, using the information she innocently provided about my personal life, while building a relationship he could exploit for even more detailed intelligence about my habits, fears, and vulnerabilities. "He knows everything about you," Rachel continued through her tears. "Your work schedule, your friends, your dating history, your finances." I told him so many private things because I thought he was family who cared about you. But last night, he showed me recordings of phone calls where your mother was saying horrible things about you, and he wanted me to help him prove that you were mentally unstable. Gary had been running a sophisticated intelligence operation against me using my own best friend as an unwitting informant while positioning himself to destroy my reputation and credibility if I continued resisting his fraud scheme. The level of psychological manipulation was staggering and made me realize that Gary was far more dangerous than I had imagined. But Rachel's confession also revealed Gary's most devastating weapon yet. He had been manipulating my mother into making those recorded statements by convincing her that I was having mental health problems and needed intervention. Linda hadn't been expressing her genuine feelings about my character. She had been coached to participate in what Gary presented as a loving intervention to save her daughter from self-destructive behavior. "Your mom thinks you're having a breakdown," Rachel explained. "Gary has been showing her evidence that you're acting erratically, making poor decisions, possibly using drugs. She's terrified that you're going to hurt yourself or ruin your life, so she's been doing whatever Gary suggests to help you." This revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about my mother's betrayal. Linda hadn't abandoned me out of selfishness or chosen Gary over her daughter. She had been manipulated into believing that supporting Gary's intervention was the only way to save me from destroying myself. Gary had weaponized my mother's love against both of us, using her maternal instincts to participate in her own daughter's emotional destruction. Understanding Gary's manipulation made me angrier than I had ever been in my life. He hadn't just tried to steal my money and ruin my credit. He had systematically destroyed my relationships with everyone I loved by convincing them that I was mentally ill and needed their help to recover. The sophistication and cruelty of his psychological warfare revealed him to be a true predator who enjoyed causing pain as much as he enjoyed stealing money. That night, I made the decision that would nearly cost me my life. Instead of calling the police or fleeing to safety, I decided to confront Gary with evidence of his manipulation and demand that he leave my family alone. I thought that exposing his lies would be enough to make him retreat, that he would abandon his scheme rather than risk exposure and arrest. I was completely wrong about how desperate and dangerous Gary had become. I decided to confront Gary at my mother's house the next evening, hoping that familiar surroundings would help Linda see through his manipulation when I presented evidence of his crimes. I printed copies of the forged loan documents, the fake legal contracts, and transcripts of the threatening conversation I had recorded at the restaurant. I also brought documentation from the bank showing the unauthorized credit inquiries and identity theft. When I arrived at the family home where I had grown up, I immediately sensed tension in the air. Gary's black pickup truck was parked aggressively across the driveway, blocking access to the garage where my mother usually parked her car. The front yard, which Linda had always maintained meticulously, showed signs of neglect, with overgrown grass and scattered beer bottles that suggested Gary had been drinking heavily outdoors. Linda answered the door looking exhausted and frightened. Her usually bright eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and she had lost noticeable weight since I had seen her just 2 weeks earlier. When she hugged me, I felt her trembling slightly and noticed a fresh bruise on her upper arm that she tried to hide beneath her long-sleeved shirt. "Gary's in the kitchen," she whispered urgently. He's been drinking since this afternoon and talking about how this is his last chance to save the business. Please be careful what you say, honey. He's not himself today. The warning should have made me leave immediately, but I was so focused on saving my family from Gary's manipulation that I ignored the obvious signs of escalating danger. I followed my mother into the kitchen where Gary sat at the table surrounded by empty beer bottles and scattered legal documents. Gary looked up as I entered, and I immediately saw that his carefully maintained facade had completely disappeared. His expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes held a wild desperation that made him look like a cornered animal. The charming businessman who had once swept my mother off her feet was gone, replaced by someone who looked capable of violence. "Well, well," Gary said, his words slightly slurred from alcohol, but his voice carrying unmistakable menace. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Come to gloat about destroying your family princess." I placed my folder of evidence on the table and tried to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "Gary, I know what you've been doing. I have documentation of the identity theft, the forged signatures, the fake legal documents, everything. This has to stop before someone gets hurt." Gary laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Hurt sweetheart people are already getting hurt. Your mother has been crying for days because her selfish daughter won't help save the family business. I've been getting phone calls from very impatient investors who expect their money soon. And you think a few pieces of paper are going to solve our problems?" He picked up one of the forged loan applications and waved it mockingly. "You think I care about your little evidence collection? You think the police are going to save you from the mess you've created by being stubborn and selfish?" Linda stood frozen by the kitchen sink, her face pale with terror as she watched Gary's anger escalate. I realized she had been living with this rage for days or weeks, walking on eggshells while Gary's schemes fell apart around him. "Mom, you need to see these documents," I said, opening my folder. "Gary has been forging my signature to apply for loans. He's committed identity theft and fraud. None of his business plans are legitimate." "Shut up!" Gary roared, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make the beer bottles jump. "Don't you dare poison her mind with your paranoid accusations. Your mother knows exactly what kind of person you are." He pulled out his phone and began playing the recorded conversation where Linda had said cruel things about my character. As my mother's voice filled the kitchen, Linda's face crumpled with shame and regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He told me you were having problems, that you needed help. He said this was the only way to make you listen to reason." "You see," Gary said triumphantly, "even your own mother knows you're selfish and ungrateful. She only said those things because she loves you and wants to help you become a better person." I showed my mother the bank documents proving Gary had forged my signature, the fake legal contracts with non-existent notaries, and the evidence that Gary's lawyer friend was unlicensed. As Linda examined the papers, her expression shifted from confusion to horror as she realized the extent of Gary's deception. "You've been lying to me," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength as understanding dawned. "You told me Susanna had agreed to help with the business. You said she was just being difficult about the paperwork." Gary's rage erupted like a volcano. He swept the documents off the table, scattering papers across the kitchen floor as he stood up to his full, imposing height. "I've been trying to save this pathetic family," he screamed. "I married a broken widow with debt problems and a selfish daughter who thinks she's too good to help her own mother. I've invested 3 years of my life in building something meaningful, and this is the thanks I get." His voice rose to a terrifying volume as years of carefully hidden resentment poured out. "You want to know the truth? I never loved either of you worthless women. You were just stepping stones to something better, Linda. You're a pathetic, needy widow who was grateful for any attention. And you, he pointed at me, you were supposed to be my ticket to real money with your perfect credit and steady job. Linda gasped as Gary's cruel words destroyed the last remnants of the loving relationship she thought they had shared. The man she had trusted with her heart, her home, and her financial security was revealing himself to be a predator who had viewed her as nothing more than a target to exploit. I've already moved most of your retirement money to offshore accounts, Gary continued with vicious satisfaction. Did you think I was going to leave it sitting in some boring mutual fund when I had better plans for it? That money has been funding my real business ventures for months. The confession hit my mother like a physical blow. Her life savings, the security my father had worked so hard to build, was gone. Gary had been systematically stealing from her while pretending to love and protect her. "Get out of my house," Linda said, her voice shaking but determined. "Get out right now and never come back." Gary's laughter was cruel and mocking. "Your house, sweetheart, this house has been collateral for my business loans for 6 months. You signed the papers yourself, remember? Those partnership agreements you thought were just formalities. They put everything you own at risk." He pulled out more documents showing that Linda had indeed signed away her rights to the family home, though she had obviously been deceived about what the papers meant. Gary had been systematically stripping away every asset our family owned while positioning himself to disappear with the proceeds. "You can't throw me out of a house that belongs to my creditors," Gary continued. "And those creditors aren't going to be happy when they learn that the business venture they invested in was sabotaged by an ungrateful stepdaughter who refused to honor her commitments." I realized that Gary was still trying to use his fictional dangerous creditors to frighten us into submission, but his rage was making him careless about maintaining the illusion. His threats were becoming more obviously desperate and less convincing. "There are no creditors," I said firmly. "You've been lying about everything. The business plans are fake, the legal documents are forged, and now you're threatening us because your con game is falling apart." Gary's face turned purple with rage. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, waving it as he screamed threats and obscenities that made Linda cower behind the kitchen island. "You stupid girls think you can ruin everything I've worked for," he yelled, brandishing the knife wildly. 3 years I've invested in this family, 3 years of pretending to care about your pathetic problems, and this is how you repay me. Linda was crying and begging Gary to put down the knife, but her pleas only seemed to fuel his rage. He was completely out of control, no longer calculating or manipulative, but simply dangerous in the way that desperate people become when their schemes collapse. "I should have handled this differently from the beginning." Gary continued, his voice taking on a chilling coldness even as he waved the knife. "I should have taken what I wanted and disappeared instead of wasting time on manipulation and legal games." I positioned myself between Gary and my mother, trying to shield her from his escalating violence while looking for an opportunity to escape or disarm him. But Gary was bigger, stronger, and armed with nothing left to lose as his carefully constructed con game fell apart around him. "You want to know what's really going to happen," Gary said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I'm going to finish what I started. One way or another, I'm getting the money I need from this family. And if you won't cooperate voluntarily, I'll find other ways to persuade you." He put away the knife but pulled out his phone, beginning to record our conversation as he had done before. But this time, his intention was clearly to create evidence for a different kind of manipulation. "I'm going to record you two attacking me," Gary said with horrific calm. "I'm going to have video evidence showing that I was forced to defend myself against a mentally unstable stepdaughter and her delusional mother. By the time the police sort out what really happened, I'll be long gone with everything I can carry. This was Gary's final plan: create fake evidence of our aggression to justify whatever violence he was about to inflict, then disappear with our remaining assets, while we dealt with legal consequences and medical bills. He had moved beyond financial fraud to planning assault, and potentially worse. I knew we were in mortal danger and had to act immediately to save our lives. Gary's transformation from manipulative con artist to violent predator was complete. As he held his phone up to record what he claimed would be evidence of our aggression, I saw in his eyes the cold calculation of someone who had moved beyond threats to planning actual violence. He was no longer trying to convince us to cooperate. He was preparing to take what he wanted by force and create a cover story to protect himself afterward. "You see how they're threatening me?" Gary said to his phone's camera, his voice suddenly calm and reasonable despite the chaos around him. "I came here to discuss legitimate business matters, and these women became violent and irrational. I'm afraid for my safety." Linda and I stood frozen, realizing that anything we said or did would be edited to support Gary's fictional narrative. He was creating evidence that would portray him as the victim of our alleged attack, setting the stage for whatever violence he planned to inflict. "Susanna has been having psychological problems for months," Gary continued to his recording. "She's been making paranoid accusations about business documents threatening family members and refusing to take responsibility for her financial obligations. Her mother and I have been trying to get her professional help, but she's become increasingly unstable and aggressive." The sophistication of Gary's manipulation was terrifying even in this desperate moment. He was constructing a plausible narrative that would explain away any injuries he caused us, portraying himself as a concerned family member trying to help a mentally ill stepdaughter who had become violent. "Now she's trying to turn her mother against me with forged documents and paranoid conspiracy theories," Gary continued. "I'm recording this conversation for everyone's protection in case she becomes violent like she's been threatening to do." Linda found her voice despite her terror. "Gary, stop this insanity! Put the phone away and leave our house immediately!" "You see the hostile environment I'm dealing with," Gary said to his camera. "These women are clearly working together to create a false narrative about legitimate business arrangements. Their aggression and irrationality speak for themselves." I realized that Gary's recording strategy was actually a weakness we could exploit. If he was determined to document our conversation, I could use that documentation against him by getting him to reveal his true intentions and criminal activities. "Gary, tell the camera about the forged loan applications," I said clearly. "Explain how you've been using my identity without permission to apply for fraudulent business loans." His composure cracked slightly as he realized I was turning his own recording against him. "That's a paranoid delusion," he said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Tell the camera about stealing my mother's retirement money," I continued. "Explain how you moved her savings to offshore accounts without her knowledge or consent." "I invested that money in legitimate business ventures," Gary shouted, his calm facade completely collapsing as his rage returned. "Everything I've done has been legal and proper. You're the one who's been sabotaging legal business arrangements." But his angry outburst was being recorded by his own phone, contradicting his claims about our alleged aggression. Gary was creating evidence of his own guilt while trying to frame us for violence that hadn't occurred. Linda stepped forward bravely, speaking directly to Gary's camera. "For the record, Gary has been lying to me for months about business investments. He forged my daughter's signature on loan applications without her knowledge. He stole my retirement savings and used my house as collateral for business deals I never approved." "Shut up!" Gary screamed, his facade completely gone as he realized his recording was becoming evidence against him rather than evidence supporting his planned cover story. He lunged forward and smashed his phone against the kitchen wall, ending the recording that would have proven our innocence and his guilt. But his violent destruction of evidence only confirmed that he had moved beyond manipulation to planning serious crimes against us. Gary grabbed me by the shoulders, his massive hands digging into my arms as he shook me with frightening force. "You've ruined everything!" he screamed inches from my face. 3 years of work destroyed by one selfish, stupid girl who couldn't see the bigger picture. His breath reeked of alcohol and his eyes were wild with the desperation of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The charming mask he had worn for 3 years was completely gone, replaced by raw violence and hatred. "I gave your pathetic family meaning and purpose?" He continued, shaking me harder. "I turned a broke widow and her loser daughter into business partners in something bigger than their small-minded dreams, and this is how you repay my generosity." Linda tried to help me break free from Gary's grip, but he backhanded her across the face with enough force to send her stumbling into the kitchen counter. The sound of the blow echoed through the house, and I saw blood on my mother's lip as she struggled to maintain her balance. "Don't you dare touch her!" I screamed, trying to claw at Gary's face as rage gave me strength beyond my size. Gary laughed at my futile resistance. "What are you going to do, princess? Fight me? You're a 120-pound dental hygienist who's never thrown a punch in her life. I'm 230 pounds of construction worker muscle who's been in real fights with real men." He was right about the physical mismatch, but I refused to let fear paralyze me while he threatened my mother's life. I grabbed a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the counter and swung it at Gary's head with all my strength, connecting with his temple, hard enough to make him stagger and release his grip on my shoulders. Blood streamed down Gary's face from the cut on his temple, but the injury only seemed to fuel his rage rather than discourage him. He roared like an angry bull and charged at me with his full weight, slamming me against the refrigerator hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs. "You want to fight?" he snarled, pressing his forearm against my throat as he pinned me against the appliance. "Let's see how tough you are when someone fights back, you spoiled little girl." Gary's forearm pressed harder against my windpipe, cutting off my air supply as black spots began appearing in my vision. I clawed desperately at his arms, trying to break free before I passed out, but his strength was overwhelming. Linda grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and struck Gary across the back of his head with surprising force. The blow was enough to make him release his chokehold on me, though it didn't knock him down as she had hoped. Gary spun around to face my mother, blood now flowing from 2 head wounds, but his rage undiminished by the injuries. "You want to play too, Linda. Let's see what happens when you pick a fight with someone who fights back." He backhanded her again, this time with enough force to send her crashing into the kitchen table. Linda hit the corner of the table hard, crying out in pain as she fell to the floor, clutching her ribs. I knew we were both going to die if Gary continued his assault. He was completely out of control, no longer thinking about consequences or escape plans, but simply venting years of hidden rage against the family he had tried to exploit. My mother was injured and possibly seriously hurt, and I was too small to physically overpower Gary without a weapon. But as Gary advanced on Linda with murder in his eyes, I remembered the emergency whistle on my keychain that Jake had given me years earlier. I pulled it out and blew it as hard as I could, creating a piercing shriek that filled the kitchen and could be heard throughout the neighborhood. The whistle's blast seemed to snap Gary back to awareness of his situation. He realized that neighbors would have heard the sound and might call police, that his window for covering up his crimes was rapidly closing. "This isn't over," he said, wiping blood from his face as he backed toward the kitchen door. "You've made enemies of people who don't forgive or forget. This family will pay for destroying my business relationships." Gary grabbed his truck keys and fled through the back door, leaving Linda and me bleeding and traumatized in the wreckage of our kitchen. I could hear his truck engine roaring to life as he sped away, probably heading to wherever he had hidden the stolen money before disappearing permanently. I called 911 immediately, reporting the assault and providing Gary's license plate number and description. Then I called Jake, who arrived just minutes before the police and paramedics, finding his mother and sister bruised and shaken, but alive. But Gary wasn't finished with his revenge against our family. His final act of cruelty would be the most devastating of all. The paramedics treated our injuries, while police officers documented the crime scene and took our statements about Gary's assault. Linda had bruised ribs and a split lip, while I had finger-shaped bruises on my neck from Gary's chokehold and scratches on my arms from being slammed against the refrigerator. The physical evidence clearly supported our account of Gary's violence. Detective Sarah Martinez, an experienced investigator with the Cleveland Police Department's fraud unit, arrived within an hour to take detailed statements about Gary's financial crimes. When I showed her the forged loan applications, fake legal documents, and evidence of identity theft, her expression grew increasingly serious. "This is one of the most sophisticated fraud schemes I've seen," Detective Martinez said. "Your stepfather has been running a long-term con operation that goes far beyond simple financial theft. The level of psychological manipulation and document forgery suggests he's done this before." She explained that Gary's use of forged signatures and fraudulent loan applications constituted federal crimes that would involve FBI investigation. The identity theft charges alone carried potential prison sentences of several years, while the assault charges would add additional time to any conviction. But as we gave our statements, Detective Martinez received a radio call that made her expression darken with concern. Gary's abandoned pickup truck had been found in a shopping center parking lot across town, but Gary himself had disappeared. Police were treating him as a dangerous fugitive who might attempt to flee the state or the country. "We've issued an all-points bulletin for his arrest," Detective Martinez explained. "His photograph and description are being shared with law enforcement agencies throughout Ohio and neighboring states. We're also freezing any bank accounts we can identify to prevent him from accessing funds for his escape." But the most shocking discovery came when police searched Gary's abandoned truck. In the glove compartment, they found a detailed notebook containing information about dozens of potential victims, including financial data, family relationships, and psychological profiles. Gary hadn't just targeted our family. He had been researching multiple victims for an elaborate fraud operation. "Your family appears to have been Gary's primary target," Detective Martinez said, "but he was also gathering intelligence on at least 20 other families in the Cleveland area. He was planning a much larger operation than we initially realized." The notebook contained photographs, financial records, and personal details about families with teenage or young adult children who might be vulnerable to Gary's manipulation tactics. He had been attending community events, church services, and social gatherings to identify potential victims and gather intelligence about their financial situations. Most disturbing was a section of the notebook labeled "Exit Strategy" that detailed Gary's plans to disappear with stolen funds once his schemes were complete. He had been preparing for months to abandon our family and move on to new victims in other states, leaving us to face the legal and financial consequences of his crimes. 3 days after the assault, Detective Martinez called with news that changed everything. The FBI had traced Gary's offshore accounts and discovered that he had stolen over $400,000 from 6 different families over the past 5 years. Our family had been his latest targets, but we weren't his first victims. "Gary Davis isn't his real name," Detective Martinez explained. "His actual name is Gerald Davidson, and he has prior convictions for fraud and identity theft in 3 other states. He's been using different identities and targeting vulnerable families for over a decade." The FBI investigation revealed that Gary had been married to 4 different women under various names, systematically draining their resources before disappearing to target new victims. He had refined his manipulation techniques over years of practice, learning to exploit grief, loneliness, and family dynamics to gain access to his target's finances. But Gary's greatest mistake was underestimating his victims' determination to seek justice. The other families he had defrauded were eager to cooperate with law enforcement once they learned about his arrest warrant. Their combined evidence painted a picture of a career criminal who had destroyed multiple families' financial security through sophisticated psychological manipulation. The breakthrough in Gary's capture came from an unexpected source. Rachel, my best friend who Gary had manipulated for information about me, recognized his photograph on the evening news and called police with crucial information. Gary had mentioned during one of their conversations that he owned property in rural Kentucky where he could disappear if business in Ohio became complicated. FBI agents raided the Kentucky property and found Gary hiding in a cabin with over $200,000 in cash and detailed plans for establishing a new identity in Florida. He was arrested without resistance, probably realizing that his criminal career had finally reached its end. During Gary's interrogation, he confessed to the full scope of his crimes, apparently hoping that cooperation might reduce his prison sentence. He admitted to forging my signature on loan applications, stealing my mother's retirement money, and assaulting both of us when his scheme was exposed. He also provided information about other victims and accomplices that helped FBI agents close several related fraud investigations. The trial took place 8 months after Gary's arrest, with victims from all 6 families testifying about his manipulation tactics and the devastating impact of his crimes. I testified about the identity theft, the forged documents, and the violent assault when his fraud was exposed. My mother courageously testified about how Gary had exploited her grief and loneliness to gain access to our family's resources. Gary's defense attorney tried to portray him as a failed entrepreneur who had made poor decisions under financial pressure, but the evidence of premeditation and multiple victims made this strategy ineffective. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Gary guilty on all charges, including federal fraud, identity theft, assault, and conspiracy. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Gary to 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 8 years. She specifically noted the psychological cruelty of his manipulation tactics and the long-term trauma he had inflicted on his victims' families. Mr. Davidson preyed on vulnerable families during their most difficult periods, Judge Williams said during sentencing. He exploited grief, loneliness, and trust to steal not just money, but peace of mind and family relationships. His sophisticated manipulation tactics show a complete lack of empathy and remorse that requires significant incarceration to protect future victims. The financial recovery process was more complex than the criminal prosecution. While FBI agents had recovered most of the cash Gary was carrying when arrested, much of the money he had stolen over the years had been spent on maintaining his fraudulent lifestyle. My mother recovered about 60% of her retirement savings, enough to maintain her financial security, though not enough to restore her original plans for retirement. The house that Gary had used as collateral for his fictional business loans was returned to my mother's ownership after courts determined that the partnership agreements were fraudulent. Linda was able to keep her home, though she chose to sell it and move to a smaller place that didn't carry memories of Gary's deception. But the most important recovery was emotional, rather than financial. My mother and I underwent family counseling to repair the damage Gary's manipulation had caused to our relationship. Learning how thoroughly he had deceived both of us helped us understand that our conflicts hadn't been genuine, but rather the result of his systematic lies and psychological warfare. Linda struggled with guilt about being deceived by Gary and putting our family at risk, but counseling helped her understand that she had been the victim of a sophisticated predator who specialized in exploiting vulnerable people. The therapist explained that Gary's manipulation tactics were so refined that even mental health professionals might have been deceived by his charm and apparent sincerity. My relationship with Rachel also required significant repair after Gary's manipulation damaged our trust. We attended several joint counseling sessions to work through the betrayal and rebuild our friendship on a foundation of honesty about how Gary had exploited our relationship. Rachel's guilt about providing Gary with personal information about me was matched by my understanding that she had been deceived as thoroughly as everyone else in our family. 6 months after Gary's sentencing, I started a support group for financial fraud victims in the Cleveland area. The group meets monthly to provide emotional support and practical advice for people rebuilding their lives after falling victim to sophisticated scams. Many group members are elderly individuals who were targeted for their savings, but we also help families who were exploited through romance scams, business fraud, and identity theft. Running the support group has given me purpose and helped me transform my traumatic experience into something positive for our community. Sharing my story helps other victims understand that being deceived by a skilled manipulator doesn't reflect personal weakness or stupidity, but rather the sophisticated nature of modern financial predators. Jake and I have grown closer through our shared experience of protecting our family from Gary's schemes. My brother's quick thinking in calling police the night of the assault probably saved our lives, and his emotional support during the investigation and trial helped our family stay strong throughout the legal process. My mother has shown remarkable resilience in rebuilding her life after Gary's betrayal. She returned to volunteer work at the local animal shelter, something she had given up during her marriage to Gary, and has developed new friendships with people who share her interests rather than her vulnerabilities. Linda has also become an advocate for elder financial abuse prevention, speaking at community events about recognizing manipulation tactics. The experience taught me that protecting yourself and setting firm boundaries isn't selfish, but necessary for everyone's safety and well-being. My refusal to sign Gary's fraudulent loan documents wasn't just about protecting my credit. It was about protecting my family from a predator who would have destroyed us all financially and emotionally. Standing in the courtroom as Gary received his sentence, watching him led away in handcuffs to begin a prison term that would keep him from hurting other families, I felt a sense of closure and justice that helped heal the trauma of his violence and manipulation. The man who had tried to destroy our family through psychological warfare and physical assault had been held accountable for his crimes. Most importantly, I learned that love without respect and honesty isn't love at all, but manipulation and control dressed up in appealing disguises. Real family relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, and supporting each other's independence rather than exploiting vulnerabilities for personal gain. Our family emerged from Gary's predatory schemes stronger and more united than before, with deeper appreciation for the genuine love and loyalty that had helped us survive his manipulation. We learned that standing up to abuse, even from family members, is sometimes the most loving thing you can do to protect the people you care about. 2 years later, I can say with confidence that refusing to co-sign those loans was the best decision I ever made. It saved not just my credit and financial future, but my family's safety and our relationships with each other. Sometimes protecting the people you love means saying no to their requests and standing firm against manipulation even when it's difficult and painful. Gary's attempt to destroy our family through fraud and violence ultimately brought us closer together and taught us the difference between genuine love and predatory manipulation. We learned that we could survive anything as long as we supported each other honestly and refused to let anyone exploit our family bonds for their personal gain. I want to ask you something that I think about often. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone tried to manipulate you by claiming that helping them was the same as helping your family? How did you recognize the difference between genuine requests for help and attempts to exploit your love for personal gain? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else recognize the warning signs of financial predators. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting survivors of financial fraud and domestic violence. I hope my experience helps you protect your own family from people who would exploit your love and trust for their personal gain. Remember that saying no to manipulation isn't selfish. It's often the most loving thing you can do. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of ordinary people overcoming extraordinary challenges. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding how financial predators operate and how families can protect themselves from sophisticated manipulation tactics. Together, we can help more people recognize the warning signs and protect their families from predators like Gary.